Did you know the Royal Ghost almost didn't get added to Clash Royale because of its strange gimmick? It was a card Supercell had been working on for a while, but was ultimately determined that it couldn't work and thus was scrapped, until December 2017, where it was made into a reality. And since then, it's contributed positively to the game, adding something new to decks that no other card could. However, it's definitely had some challenges getting to where it is, so today we're going to cover the entire history of the Royal Ghost, including the balance changes it's received over the years, and why they eventually did decide to give him a spot in the arena. As I stated, the concept of a ghost card was thought of long before the Royal Ghost was added. So why wasn't it added earlier? Well, in an old episode of Radio Royale from March 2017, they discussed their reasoning.
The Ghost was a troop, maybe like medium tankiness, I don't know, it didn't really matter. It could turn invisible and therefore not be detected by any troop. It would run up to the nearest troop, reveal itself, go boo, and basically stun the enemy. And then from there, it could start attacking and start being attacked.
So we killed that card specifically because it was quite complicated. It's quite difficult to understand and read. But we did actually sort of take that kind of difference in sort of movement mechanic and apply that to another card that's coming in the next update.
The concept was different in several ways from the final form. A card that was invisible, could dash, and stun. It was certainly complicated. Supercell confirmed, however, that they took this concept and turned it into a different card, which would eventually be known as the Bandit. The main thing Bandit received from the original Ghost concept was the dashing ability, which made her temporarily invincible. The key difference being that it didn't have to start attacking to be visible and vulnerable, and it didn't stun troops upon attacking, because the whole idea was that it was going to pop into visibility and scare the troop. So this was thought to be the end of it. The Ghost didn't quite work out, but they borrowed the idea to create a different card. Obviously we know they did add the Ghost later, but why? How did they eventually tweak him into something unique from the already existing Bandit and from its originally planned form? The main gimmick of the new Royal Ghost was going to be invisibility until it attacked, which was the part based on the original plan. Like I already said, the Bandit sort of had invisibility with its dash, but that only lasted a fraction of a second. The Royal Ghost would be able to sneak around the arena, remaining untargetable by anything and everything. However, just because the Royal Ghost was untargetable while invisible, doesn't mean plenty of cards still couldn't deal damage to it. It would still take damage from any damage dealing spell, and if the Ghost was too close to a friendly troop being attacked by a splash card, then its attack would splash onto him. This is what separates him from Tesla. Unlike the original plan, Royal Ghost was going to lack the dashing ability and also not stun its initial target when becoming visible. The Ghost was heavily talked about throughout 2017, because even though we had the Bandit, players believed the Ghost had something unique to offer, and it seems like Supercell agreed because despite being deconfirmed in March 2017, the October 2017 Incline update added the Ghost card in the files, which basically confirmed it would be a reality in a matter of months. Looking at the leaks from the time, it shows the placeholder card art as well as that it was a 4 elixir legendary. Some players had hopes that it would come out that month since it was Halloween season and a Ghost would be more than fitting, but it wouldn't be officially revealed until 2 months later in December, where it was officially revealed to be a 3 elixir legendary. One major misconception going around was that the Ghost was going to be invisible to the eyes of the player, which was a very scary thought. It was imagined you would see nothing 1 second, then the next second you would see a Royal Ghost on your tower. When this misconception was cleared up, players were a lot more optimistic. The Royal Ghost wasn't going to be fully released until January 2018, but on December 22nd, 2017, it was technically available to unlock early. To get the Royal Ghost early, you had to get 12 wins in a special challenge, which was much more difficult back then since there was no gold pass to give you infinite retries, and if you lost 3 times, your wins were reset to 0, so most players would not be getting it early. Most challenges that introduce a new card either have you build a deck around it, or a draft challenge where one player is guaranteed to get it. But this challenge was different because it was a mirror challenge, so both players would get the exact same deck with the exact same cycle. And of course, along with the mirror, both players would get a Royal Ghost. This was odd because these challenges are supposed to give you a good taste of the new card. Building a deck around it is good because it allows you to test out multiple strategies and deck types with it. And draft is good too because you'll be forced to use a lot of different cards to try with and against the new card, not just being able to craft a deck specifically to counter it. but a mirror challenge only allows you to test the Royal Ghost in Ditto matches, and you get no choice or freedom as to what deck you played. It was a fun challenge regardless, but not the best way to see what the card had to offer. This was actually a really special challenge in another way though, because it took place in a unique Christmas themed arena designed specifically for this challenge along with newly designed towers. Remember, this was pre-Pass Royale, so there were no custom season arenas or tower skins yet. Even though the arena was basically just a slightly modified version of Frozen Peak, it was still a nice touch the devs didn't have to do. But on top of that, this arena had its own unique soundtrack. It was a special Christmas battle theme that was only used for this one challenge and never brought back again. All of this made this challenge feel for me exceptionally memorable. But anyway, we're getting a little off topic. So how was the Royal Ghost upon launch? Well, it was definitely one of the more unique cards ever released. We already talked about his unique invisibility mechanic, so let's go over exactly how this mechanic molded the way he was played, and what advantages and disadvantages he had. Since he wouldn't be targetable until he attacked, you had to time him differently in a lot of scenarios. For example, when countering a musketeer, usually you want to place your defense when she crosses the bridge, right as she enters the tower's range, but before she locks onto the tower. With the Royal Ghost, you had to play it way earlier, since it would take 1.5 seconds after being placed to be visible to the musketeer. If you timed it the same as a knight, the musketeer would lock onto the tower, which is not what you wanted. Having a melee card that would get the first attack on ranged cards gave it such a leg up, because against any other melee card, the ranged card would get so much damage in before the melee card could get close enough to attack. Another major advantage it had was being able to take out spirits. Against any other melee card, the spirits would jump on them before they could attack. Ghost was also great against Teslas. Since Tesla was invisible when it wasn't active, if a solo Royal Ghost went to the opponent's side with a Tesla, it would completely ignore it, rushing right to the tower instead. And perhaps one of its greatest advantages was the fact that even at 1 HP, a Royal Ghost would have to be responded to or else it would get a hit on the tower. Against most troops, the Princess Tower had no problem cleaning up if they were low on HP. Even if the Royal Ghost only took 1 or 2 elixir to prevent that single hit, that was still a huge deal. Remember, it was only 3 elixir. This led to some potentially interesting scenarios, like if you wanted to tank for your Royal Ghost that was low on HP, you just had to have something cross the bridge before it hit something. Royal Ghost's invisibility also meant that he was one of the few troop targeting troops to not counter himself. Neither of them could see each other, therefore neither of them would attack nor turn visible. If all of that wasn't enough, it was also completely immune to balloon and giant skeleton death bombs. However, invisibility was a double-edged sword. The advantages were huge, sure, but it also had some major disadvantages, one of which being that you couldn't pull cards to the center. You usually want to pull cards towards the center to maximize the distance the opposing troop has to walk to get to your Princess Tower, but that just wasn't possible here. It was especially frustrating if you were trying to distract a siege building or flying unit. Comparing it to the Knight at the time, for the same cost, it dealt way more damage per swing, but had a slower hit speed. Overall, they dealt about the same damage per second. Royal Ghost did about the same damage as the Log, so it could one-shot things like Princess, Ice Spirit, Dark Goblin, etc. It had less health, but a slightly longer range. It also had a movement speed classified as fast, as opposed to the Knight's medium movement speed. This was likely to ensure the Ghost could catch its target rather than endlessly chasing it, since the target wouldn't see the Ghost and run away. Overall, their stats were fairly similar, but the invisibility gave the Ghost a huge leg up overall. But the Ghost had another significant advantage over the Knight I didn't mention, and that was the fact it dealt splash damage. It didn't feel natural for a card like this to splash onto multiple troops per hit, but for whatever reason, it did. It just felt like it was like a mini P.E.K.K.A. or a Knight, and imagining those cards dealing splash damage just felt wrong. Now, the splash radius was very small, just 8/10 of a tile, but even anything was odd. And many players that used the card in multiple matches were unaware it dealt splash damage at all. So really, just looking at these stats, the card was looking like a beast. I know it's easy to look back retrospectively to see how a card broke the meta, but in this case, the stats made it obvious this card was going to be overpowered. He was essentially a Knight with added special abilities, and at the time of the Ghost coming out, Knight was already a pretty strong card, appearing in about 30% of top ladder decks. So knowing all this, it's no surprise Royal Ghost was insanely overused upon release. People were saying it was potentially the strongest card ever released, comparing it to the Night Witch's launch. Even though the earliest possible day to unlock it was December 22nd, it still finished in 73 of the top 200, or about 37% of the top finishing decks, making it the second most used card and most used troop card in competitive play. This was despite the fact it was only available to those who got 12 wins in the limited challenge and the leveling limitations that came with it being legendary. Remember, not only were the challenges harder back then, but there were no trade tokens, wild cards, magic books, nothing. The most efficient way to level it up was to spend thousands of gems mass opening legendary king's chests. So many of the potential top players couldn't even use Royal Ghost to its fullest potential, but there were many players using under-leveled ghosts in top ladder still. You were seeing the Royal Ghost used in everything from minor control to P.E.K.K.A, Giant Beatdown, and Hog Rider decks. Even some Golem and Three Musketeer players were finding ways to utilize him. The number one most popular Royal Ghost deck by far though was this Mega Knight Swarm deck. This exact variation made up 1/8 of the top finishing ladder decks for the December 2017 season. As a result of his strength, Royal Ghost was heavily boxing out Knight and Bandit. Although Royal Ghost appeared to be a direct substitution for Bandit, Knight still saw some usage competitively. This can be partially attributed to the fact that more people had him maxed out, but Knight was actually still preferable in a few decks, most notably Logbait and Hog X NATO. Because when you were using him in decks like that, you didn't want him to be invisible due to him often being used to tank for cards like Hog Rider or Goblin Barrel even when out of combat. I find it kind of funny that Ghost was replacing Bandit in a lot of decks though, because the Bandit and Royal Ghost are essentially different variations of the same base design, and now they both existed as two separate cards. Royal Ghost was universally available on January 4th, 2018, and it remained very popular. It undoubtedly needed a major nerf. Nobody disagreed with that notion, and Supercell made it clear that it would be getting some attention in the next set of balance changes. These balance changes would come on January 24th, 2018, and it would be getting a total of 6 nerfs. Its damage was decreased by 6%, and its hit speed was increased by 1/10 of a second, so his total damage per second was decreased by about 12%. The biggest interaction difference this caused was taking one additional hit to take out Ice Wizards and Witches. Its first hit attack time was increased by 1/10 of a second as well, which didn't hurt the Royal Ghost as much as it would for other cards because it was untargetable until that first hit landed. And his sight range was increased to make him more distractible. But the biggest nerf of all is undoubtedly the required time of being out of combat to turn invisible being increased by half a second. This was probably the best change of all. It was so frustrating to counter Royal Ghost before because it would turn invisible so fast once it was done attacking. Now it was vulnerable for a much longer period of time, which allowed for much more flexibility in countering. And finally, his immunity to death bombs was removed, as that was unintentional. These nerfs were a lot, but justified for such an overpowered card. But because it was so much, it was hard to tell initially if the changes were over the top, still not quite enough, or just about right. They would certainly need some time to settle in. These changes went live only a couple of weeks before the end of the season, and if we observe the top ladder finishing use rate for January 2018, its use rate had dropped nearly 2/3 from the previous season to about 13%, which was about the ideal range you would want a card to be in at the time. So all in all, it went down as a solid balance change. You didn't see Ghost in everything, but he was still very useful in a couple of decks. He was mostly appearing with P.E.K.K.A now, but not exclusively. A few Giant Beatdown players continued to use him as well. However, the Ghost's place in the meta did not remain stable. It continued to have major developments. In February 2018, the Dark Prince received a buff that made him very popular. As a result, P.E.K.K.A and Giant decks ditched the Ghost in favor of him, subsequently causing his use rate to fall even further. He was only used in 5 of the top 200 decks. 2 were P.E.K.K.A, 2 were Hog Rider, and 1 was Giant Beatdown. The Giant Beatdown one finished the highest at number 9 in the world. The following season though, 3 Musketeers were claiming the Ghost. Ghost once again finished in 5 of the top 200 decks. 4 of the 5 were 3 Musketeers, and 1 was P.E.K.K.A. This fall from grace made some players claim that the January nerfs were too much. Ghost may have been a bit niche at this point, but he was still very useful in a few decks. Besides, it was clear that the Dark Prince was replacing and heavily boxing it out, so the smart move was to see how the Royal Ghost would be affected by the inevitable Dark Prince nerf. This nerf would come in April, and sure enough, following this balance change, Royal Ghost's usage usage rate surged, since P.E.K.K.A. and Giant users were including him a lot more again. The resurgence of Ghost following the Dark Prince nerf shattered the doubt of his viability. A buff was out of the question. His rates were very healthy, maybe even getting a little too healthy. Just because he was appearing a lot with Giant and P.E.K.K.A. again doesn't mean he still wasn't often used in Three Musketeers or even the occasional Hog Rider deck. In fact, in May 2018, this Hog 3M deck was trending, which rose to become the #1 deck in the game. And even a Royal Ghost Graveyard deck briefly reached the top deck list. This month was really eye-opening to the fact that Royal Ghost was a very powerful, versatile card, even if he wasn't overused. To me, it seemed like he was sort of on the border of needing and not needing a nerf. It was too tough of a call now, so the best thing seemed to be to let the card settle for a bit longer. But apparently Supercell didn't think so, because in June 2018, he would receive another nerf. All it simply was increasing his invisibility timer by 0.4 of a second. In the explanation for this change, Supercell explains that it was one of the highest winning cards in the game, and this change was meant to allow the tower to get one extra hit on the ghost before turning invisible again, while keeping all the combat interactions the same. This change seemed to garner some controversy. Some players just thought the nerf was unnecessary. My theory is that part of it was because it was thriving so much with Three Musketeers. Throughout 2018, Supercell was nerfing just about any card that worked well with Three Musketeers because they were so adamant on making them perform worse without directly nerfing them. I don't think that's the main reason they nerfed Ghost, but it could have pushed them over the edge. At the time, it was hard to say if this nerf was really necessary because its use rate wasn't excessively high, but it was a rather small nerf, so maybe it was just the right amount. Looking back retrospectively, it's safe to say this was a good change. Immediately following the balance changes going live, Royal Ghost was fine. It was still a regular in the decks it was already appearing in, and continued to see a lot of usage. Weirdly enough, its usage only seemed to be increasing preceding the nerf. Part of this can be attributed to the Dark Prince nerf that came a few weeks later. Royal Ghost was becoming a staple in P.E.K.K.A. decks, and with Dark Prince phasing out of the archetype and Magic Archer supporting it, P.E.K.K.A. decks were becoming much more prominent. Three Musketeers were also still on the uprise, which carried Ghost even further. These two archetypes combined carried Royal Ghost so far. It was still outshining similar cards like Knight and Valkyrie, taking their spot in the most popular variants. By October 2018, this card's use rate in Grand Challenges was exploding, rising to 34% usage with a very high win rate. And by the start of November, Seth, the community manager, talked about in a balance change explanation video that the Royal Ghost's use rate hit 40% in Grand Challenges with a 60% win rate, making it the most used troop card and highest winning card. These rates were higher than when it was originally released. Of course, now almost everybody had the card and knew how to play it better, but that's still crazy to think about considering how nerfed he was compared to then. With his popularity exploding, a nerf was inevitable, and this would come in November as I already said. But all it would be is a health decrease of 9%. A relatively small nerf considering he was the most popular card in the game, but it would definitely have a grave impact. There were no major interaction differences caused by this change, but most cards would take him out in one less shot now, which would prevent more instances of him turning invisible with 1 HP and getting a swing on the tower, which was still a pretty major frustration. They could have increased the time it took for him to turn invisible again, but that likely wouldn't have been enough here to make him properly balanced. Following these nerfs, the Ghost's usage fell immensely. The change definitely had a huge effect, but it still wasn't a bad card. Three Musketeers had pretty much ditched it entirely, but it still saw a lot of play in P.E.K.K.A. decks. It saw a lot of play in this rising now iconic P.E.K.K.A. Bridge Spam deck. Bridge Spam hadn't really included the Royal Ghost previously, but its fast movement speed helped him fit right in. Other than the invisibility obviously, that movement speed was the biggest thing helping him stand out from his competition. With the constant stat nerfs it had been receiving, it needed to rely on those unique attributes to have any chance of surviving this meta. The Ghost was still doing pretty well going into 2019, but it was really only ever being seen in this one specific P.E.K.K.A. Bridge Spam variant. It continued to be a very popular deck, so the rates were fine for now, but being good in only one deck meant that once that deck was inevitably nerfed in one way or another, it would fall apart, and thus Royal Ghost would have nowhere to go. Retrospectively, this was very apparent. Battle Ram was nerfed in January and March 2019, and the Bandit was nerfed in April. The rates dropped substantially from March to April alone, and for the first time in Clash Royale history, Royal Ghost had below healthy rates. P.E.K.K.A. bridge spam continued to thrive despite the nerfs, but it was much less prominent. It continued to be the only deck Royal Ghost got any spotlight in. It was crazy just thinking about how much a small health nerf affected it. Before the HP nerf, it was the most used card in the game, being used in 40% of Grand Challenge decks, but only a few months after a 9% HP nerf that didn't even have any major interaction effects, it was down to just 2% usage, and the rates wouldn't really rise much from there. In August 2019, P.E.K.K.A. would get a huge buff, making it appear almost everywhere, so you'd think one of the best P.E.K.K.A. decks would be thriving like crazy, leading to a huge rise in Royal Ghost usage, but the rates really didn't rise at all. You mostly just saw new P.E.K.K.A. decks forming without the Ghost. Even though so many other P.E.K.K.A. support cards had noticeable upticks, Royal Ghost was still suffering. If there was a time for a Royal Ghost uptick, this was it, so the fact that it wasn't showed just how poor of a state the card was in. Supercell took notice of this, so in the next set of balance changes, as P.E.K.K.A. was getting nerfed, Royal Ghost was getting its first ever buff. This was a splash radius increase of 0.2 of a tile. I still thought it was weird that he dealt splash damage at all, but this was actually smart if you think about it, because it was a way to buff it that helped it stand out from its main competitor, the Knight. This change made the Ghost a much better counter to swarms and led to a lot more players using it overnight. And after a few weeks of settling in, the card ended up in a healthy position. However, the following month, the rates sunk once again, as it did not fit in with the chaotic Season 4 environment. This was only as a result of a very chaotic, unbalanced meta, so the rates during this time were not a good indication on the card's actual strength. Around this time, the card was considered to be average to slightly below average depending on who you asked. Some argued it needed a small buff, others believed it was just fine. Towards the end of Season 5, however, it was revealed that the Royal Ghost would be getting a very interesting new change. On November 23rd, 2019, a new card, the Battle Healer, was revealed. And one interesting thing about the Battle Healer was that it had a new hovering mechanic, which meant it was not quite a ground troop, but also not an air troop. This hovering mechanic allowed the Battle Healer to cross the river at any point and not take damage from the Earthquake spell while still being targetable by ground attacking troops. This prompted some discussion about the Ghost. Many players were suggesting this hovering mechanic would make perfect sense for the Ghost because he already floated, and this could be the small buff he needed to be a balanced card. Apparently, the devs were on board with this idea, as Drew, the other community manager, said that it was extremely likely Royal Ghost would be getting the hover mechanic when Battle Healer was added. I would say that it would make the Royal Ghost feel even more legendary than he already was, but this exact mechanic technically originated on a rare card, so it's not really legendary. However, just days before the release of the healer, the hover mechanic was scrapped. Supercell didn't really say why, and it was weird because this was deconfirmed only about a week after Supercell themselves boasted about this mechanic in their announcement video. Some players rumored this was due to potential balancing issues, but this was more likely due to bugs. You see, in the preview gameplay posted by creators, the Battle Healer was completely immune to damage by certain cards. This included the Bomber, Bomb Tower, Mega Knight, Mortar, and even Sparky. If the hover mechanic meant being immune to those 5 cards, it would be game breaking, so it was good this didn't make it into the live game. It also nudged air troops and didn't get nudged by ground troops, which was really weird since it was technically still a ground troop and it definitely wasn't on the same axis as an air card. It was unclear if the hover mechanic would eventually be added when the bugs were patched out, or if it was scrapped entirely. Regardless, in the Royal Ghost's case in the following months, it didn't seem very necessary. Its December stats showed it had average rates, so adding the hover mechanic may have made it a little too strong and ultimately forced the devs to nerf something else to compensate. And why would you want to go through all that effort for a balanced card? P.E.K.K.A. bridge spam was having another resurgence in popularity, but with the overpowered magic archer replacing minions, and this deck would go on to be more iconic than the previous iteration. Royal Ghost was riding this wave of what could only be temporary, but nevertheless, he had an important role in a meta deck. In fact, throughout the first few months of 2020, this was by far the most popular deck in Clash Royale, but despite Royal Ghost thriving in this deck and it being the #1 deck for months, it wasn't really seeing any play outside of it. In fact, there was a less popular variant that just straight up subbed out the Royal Ghost for Dark Prince. Even in his best deck, his spot wasn't secure, but because the deck was just that popular, Royal Ghost's rates remained average. But it was clear that this was not going to last forever, and the rates falling in April 2020 following the Magic Archer nerf made this abundantly clear. Royal Ghost needed something to become more versatile and welcomed into other decks. At least, that's what it seemed like. There was another favorable development for Ghost following the June 2020 balance changes. Three Musketeers were given a big buff, and following the buff, a new 3M Royal Hog bridge spam deck that included the Ghost garnered some heavy usage. This is no surprise considering we saw Royal Ghost appear in Three Musketeers a lot throughout 2018. With Ghost now having a prominence in two popular decks, his rates were back to being about average. It was unclear how steady this position was. On the plus side, it was appearing in two different meta decks. Sure, they were both bridge spammy, but P.E.K.K.A and Three Musketeer decks were formed very differently, and the fact it could have a place in two decks at all meant it must have some sort of potential to thrive even if the meta changes. However, it was still not appearing much outside of these two very specific decks. If there were even slight variations that garnered popularity, they always ditched it. It was just in such a weird, uncertain position. If left to settle, it likely would have kept fluctuating or even died. But there would be some more major developments in October 2020, one of which was a major nerf to the Three Musketeers. It sucked because the Three Musketeers weren't even that strong at the time, but the Solo Musketeer was dominating the metagame so much that Three Musketeers had to be nerfed as a consequence of toning that card down. But the same set of balance changes would also do something that many players thought by this point was outruled, and that was giving the Royal Ghost the long-awaited hover ability. Almost 1 year after it was originally supposed to be implemented. This was going to severely increase his versatility and hopefully separate him enough that he could be viable even in a night-filled meta. The Royal Ghost could cross the river at any point now, allowing him to get to troops or buildings placed in the middle way quicker. The question was though, would this new feature compensate for the fact that Three Musketeers were not going to be competitively viable anymore? Would Royal Ghost be able to adapt to new decks? After the balance changes went live, the Ghost's rates remained very healthy. P.E.K.K.A Bridge Spam was of course still incredibly popular, but you now also saw it appear in some other bridge spammy type decks without the P.E.K.K.A, and there was even a trending Royal Giant deck that included it. The hover gave it that little boost of versatility it needed and put it on a bright path for the future. Despite a lot of the hover related bugs we saw before being patched out, it still had some weird mechanics that made it function more like an air troop, even though it was still technically considered ground. Like when placed in the back, it would just float over the towers as if it was an air troop, and it could still nudge air troops. This was patched in December 2020 to be fully functional as intended. Kinda makes me wonder why they didn't just implement it in December 2020 when all the bugs were fixed. As we observe the Ghost through 2021, it unfortunately seems to be back to only appearing in P.E.K.K.A Bridge Spam. It's amazing that this deck was still around, but the fact it was continuously thriving in this deck likely prevented it from getting any sort of buff, because if it got buffed directly, P.E.K.K.A Bridge Spam would become way too strong. And it's not like this deck was simply remaining low on the top deck list like Hog 2.6 or Logbait was. It was still consistently one of the, if not the most popular deck throughout most of 2021. From March to June 2021, P.E.K.K.A Bridge Spam alone made up about 2% of the decks in the game, just including the main version and the variant that replaced Poison with Fireball. I've been arguing in this video how Royal Ghost can't really remain in the meta if it's only thriving in one deck, because if a deck is too good, it will be inevitably nerfed and thus the niche card will be left without a place. And we've already seen that kind of happen back in 2019, but P.E.K.K.A Bridge Spam always found a way to bounce back. And it was so weird because even though there were new variants popping up frequently, the main one that included Ghost was usually the dominant one, when usually over time, old meta decks completely fall out permanently due to massive meta shifts. But this one was still thriving 2 years later, even against modern variations. 3 if you include the variant before that that had minions instead of Magic Archer. Seth stated in the video talking about how they balance cards that one of their goals was to have every card used in at least one meta deck. With P.E.K.K.A Bridge Spam's reluctance to phase out, Royal Ghost might have had a stable future after all, and it was fine that it may have only been used in that one deck. So 2021 for the most part wasn't a great nor a bad year for the Ghost. Could it have been tweaked in a way to make him a little healthier? Sure, but it was a low priority. Even a small tweak likely would have made it less healthy than it already was. However, in October 2021, there was a major development to Ghost, mostly thanks to the addition of the Archer Queen. Overnight, Royal Ghost's use rate shot up to over 20% in grand challenges. Archer Queen boosted bridge spam decks immensely, but that alone can't explain this massive upsurge. Archer Queen benefited plenty of other archetypes than bridge spam. She was extremely popular upon release and very influential, and Royal Ghost just so happened to be a very good counter. Archer Queen was the only other card that utilized invisibility, but it worked differently from the Royal Ghost. It would only turn invisible when the player activated its ability. Then it would be invisible for a few seconds while it rapidly fired. So if you placed just about any card on top of it, the Queen user would use the ability, and your defense would be unable to fight the Queen and get evaporated. But since the Royal Ghost had to be in combat to stay visible, if you placed a Ghost on the Queen and the Queen user used their ability, the Ghost would turn invisible before it was taken out, thus not going to complete waste like most other cards would. If they didn't use the ability, then it could take her out for a positive elixir trade. Archer Queen remained influential for a while despite some nerfs, so the Ghost was used much more in the final few months of 2021 compared to the rest of the year. But even with further Queen nerfs in 2022, Royal Ghost held on to its newly garnered popularity. It was nerfed again in April 2022, which pretty much put an end to those Queen spam decks. But in the same set of balance changes, Golden Knight was given a nifty buff, and with this, you saw another rise of Three Musketeers with him, which gave another opening for Royal Ghost to shine. He was also appearing in some Golden Knight Goblin Drill decks a bit later. By June 2022, it had been about 8 months since champions were introduced, and in those 8 months, Ghost had maintained above average rates. Besides the classic P.E.K.K.A. Bridge Spam deck, which was still the most popular Ghost deck through all of this mind you, every single top Ghost deck in that time frame had either an Archer Queen or Golden Knight. Champions were very influential and clearly boosted the Ghost a lot. It could be argued that the champions needed to be nerfed, and once that happened, the Ghost's rates would go down with them. Royal Ghost was average to below average before champions were added, which only helps to prove this notion. But the fact of the matter is, Royal Ghost was thriving with champions, and even if they needed a nerf, ideally they'd still be viable, and if that was the case, the Ghost would still have higher rates than it should. So Supercell ultimately decided in June that it was time for another Ghost nerf. On June 7th, 2022, the Royal Ghost received its final balance change. All it simply was increasing its invisibility timer by an additional 0.2 of a second. A lot of players probably wouldn't even notice this change unless it was told to them. But of course, a nerf is a nerf. This change barely hurt the card. It was just fine after these changes. But the types of decks you were seeing him in were shifting again, because now, it was Giant Skeleton season. You saw a lot of Giant Skeleton decks rising in popularity like Giant Skeleton Goblin Drill and Double Giant Siege. Basically decks you were seeing him in before, but now with Giant Skeleton. Throughout this period, that's mostly what you saw Royal Ghost in, except of course, classic P.E.K.K.A. Bridge Spam. Giant Skeleton became even more popular following the Electro Giant nerf in August 2022, and this is also when the yearly 20-win challenge took place. And during this challenge, practically out of nowhere, this Giant Skeleton mirror deck rose as being the most successful deck in the 20-win challenge, winning well over 100 20-win challenges while maintaining an overall 61% win rate. This deck won more than any other deck in that challenge, and Ghost played a critical role within it. But Giant Skeleton and Mirror were both nerfed in September, leading to the deck's downfall. However, that certainly didn't stop the Ghost. At the end of 2022, the rates were still amazing, exceeding the standard boundary of use and win rate for a healthy card. It was looking like it was going to need another nerf because its popularity was only increasing. You saw new variants of Giant Skeleton and Royal Giant going around, a semi-new variant of Three Musketeers, and the same P.E.K.K.A. deck from 2019. Evolution upgrades were added in June 2023, and since the Royal Giant was one of the few cards to get one, it helped to maintain the popularity of this one the Ghost was thriving in. Also, I thought I should mention, the evolved Royal Giant dealt surrounding damage every time he fired, which made a lot of ground troops bad at countering him. Now, Royal Ghost was never a good counter to Royal Giant, but its hover ability made it immune to this damage effect, which was a nice bonus. As more evolutions were released, P.E.K.K.A. Bridge Spam had finally fallen off the top deck list in late 2023. With them becoming more and more necessary to have in a deck, and with no cards in P.E.K.K.A. Bridge Spam having an evolution, there just wasn't a hope. There were a few notable decks Royal Ghost worked his way into, but it was basically just slightly different variations of decks he was already popular in. Despite his ability to adapt fairly well, his rates were falling in late 2023 with the fall of classic P.E.K.K.A. Bridge Spam. This brings us to 2024, where the only major development is the P.E.K.K.A. buff in March, which led to a brief uptick in Ghost usage, but since then, it's fallen kinda low. Part of his recent struggles could have been thanks to the evolved Knight, but despite that evolution being so prevalent, Ghost has still been preferred in a few decks. Today, Royal Ghost seems to be a very average card, far from useless, but far from his peak. When you see him now, it'll probably be in some sort of P.E.K.K.A. Bridge spammy deck, so pretty much the place he's been in for most of his life. Before we wrap up, did you know originally the Royal Ghost slippers were going to be baby dragons? The reason this was changed to something more generic was because it was too much detail and effort for something so small and unnoticeable. Interestingly enough, in the Champions trailer in October 2021, the king can actually be seen wearing baby dragon slippers, which makes me wonder if there's some sort of connection. According to a comment allegedly from Supercell support, they reference a tweet the official account made saying that Royal Ghost wanted to show off his slippers. I could see him wanting to show them off if they were the cool baby dragon slippers, but generic blue slippers are nothing to be proud of. Maybe the evolved Royal Ghost can get baby dragon slippers. As for the future of Ghost, I probably wouldn't give it any balance changes, but for the evolution, I think they should give it its originally planned stun ability. The original Ghost in development was supposed to scare troops that it hit when it became visible. They'd get scared, caught off guard, tripping them up and making them vulnerable for a bit. The idea seems a little broken for the regular Ghost, so it should really only be considered for an evolution. Anyway guys, thank you so much for listening. Let me know which card's history you would like to see next, and I'll catch you later.